Hi, in this video, let's understand how Spring Boot handle dependency injection. In the last video, we created a character class. This character class represents a character in a game. This character has ability to use special skills. Every time you call use special skill method, this character will be able to use different skills. We have skills like flying and invisibility. Instead of creating the object of different type of skill like flying and invisibility in our character class, we use one interface, that is skill. That interface has a method called use. Both flying and invisibility implement skill interface because both of them are skills, and we use that interface reference in our character class to use different kind of skill. We create object of different type of skill in a separate class, and we inject those object into character class through the constructor. Okay, so this is what we did in the last class. One thing you notice, though we move the object creation process outside the character class, we are still creating the objects in a separate class, but that is what we want to avoid. Now that is possible using Spring Boot. Now let's understand how Spring Boot handle dependency injection. Now in Spring Boot, we have something called component scan. If you have a Spring Boot application like this, your main class will be annotated by default with Spring Boot application. Now if you look inside the Spring Boot application, you will realize it is a combination of multiple annotations, and one of them is component scan. So what is this component scan? Before starting your application, Spring Boot scan different classes in your project. It particularly look for special kind of annotations on different classes. In this case, let's consider one of those annotation is component. So while scanning, if Spring Boot find any class which is annotated with component, Spring Boot create one object of that class and keep it in a container and use this object based on their requirement. So if you see, we know we need an object of flying. So let's annotate flying with component so that now flying is eligible for component scanning. Spring Boot will scan flying, create an object of flying and keep it. Similarly, we can annotate invisibility as well as character. Now all these three classes are annotated with component. Now all three of them are eligible for component scanning. So before starting our application, Spring Boot will scan these classes and create object of all the three classes and keep them in a container. Now there is one more thing. If you see this character class, so it depends on an object of type skill. So there is one more annotation which represent the dependency in Spring Boot. So while performing the component scan, if we mark this as auto wired, so this is the annotation. If Spring Boot see that one of the variable as auto wired annotation, then Spring will understand, okay, this character class depends on the object of type skill. Okay, if we are using Spring Boot, we do not have to write the constructor. Okay, so now we marked all these three classes with component and we represent the dependency using auto wire. Okay, now let's understand how all this component scanning actually work. Now if you see this diagram, this is what we did. We have our flying class annotated with component. We have invisibility annotated with component. We have our character class with component annotation, and this character class depends on the skill, and that is represented using auto wired annotation. So before starting the application, Spring Boot internally has a container that is called IOC container. IOC stands for inversion of control. Every time while scanning your project, if Spring Boot find any class annotated with some special annotation like component, then Spring create object of those and keep those objects in a container. An IOC container is that. So first, before starting our application, Spring Boot will scan the class. For example, here it is scanning flying class. Then next, it will create an object of flying class and keep it in the IOC container. Same thing it will do for invisibility. It will scan invisibility, create an object of invisibility, and keep it in IOC. Next, it will scan character, will create an object, but during the scanning it will realize, okay, our character class depends on skill. So now what it will do is it will look into the IOC container and it will search, do I have a object of type skill? Now when it will be looking into object for type skill, it realize, okay, I have two different objects, both are of type skill. So I have flying of type skill, invisibility of type skill. Now the problem is Spring does not know which object you want, whether you want flying or invisibility. We are telling Spring using the auto-wired annotation that we want a object of type skill. But now in IOC container, there are two objects of type skill. One is flying and invisibility. Now Spring does not know which one it should inject into our class. So this is kind of a conflict. So Spring will in this case generate one error. It won't be able to start the application because it looking for a object of type skill and it found two and it does not know which object it should inject. Because if you see, Spring is not that advanced that will look into our code and just create everything. We tell Spring what to do. The IOC container, whatever inside that Spring create, it depends on the metadata. And in this case, we are providing the metadata using different type of annotations. So when we mark a class as component, Spring understood, okay, the user wants an object to be created for this class. When we mark something with auto-wired, Spring would understand, okay, this component depends on a different object. In this case, the character depends on skill. But now we are not telling Spring which skill type object we want, whether we want flying or invisibility. Now let's run our application and see. So if you click on your Spring Boot application, you can go and run it. It started. Now if you'll see whatever we discussed, the field skill required a single bean but two were found. Okay, and it is saying, okay, it required a single bean but it found flying and invisibility. Now this is what we want to avoid. So there is one annotation using what we can tell Spring that in this kind of scenario which object to use. So for that, first what we need to do in component, while annotating our class as component, we need to provide one ID to our classes. So in this case I'm giving flying. So while creating object of flying class, Spring will provide one ID to this flying, that is flying. Similarly, let's do it for invisibility. Okay, and here in our character class, when we annotate with auto-wired, like we need a object of type skill, we also need to provide using qualifier. So qualifier is that annotation. Using this we can provide which object we want. So we have to provide the type. Let's say I want, or the ID, we need to provide the ID. So let's say I want flying. Okay, now we are telling Spring, okay, I need a object of type skill and the ID should be flying. So now this is what we changed. Now we have flying. We are providing one ID while creating the object. So we are telling Spring that when you create this object, as it is annotated with component, you use flying. You provide one ID called flying to this object. Similarly, you provide invisibility as an ID to invisibility object. And here, while we are providing auto-wired annotation that okay, our class depends on skill, we provide something called qualifier, and using qualifier, Spring will be able to understand, okay, what is the skill it need, like which object we want, whether it is flying or invisibility. In this case, it is flying. Once we use this ID, Spring will create objects and assign one ID to it. So in this case, it is flying, and for invisibility, it is invisibility. And now when Spring will look into this container, like is there any object present in the container? So initially it was just checking is there any object present in the container of type skill, but now it is also checking, and that object should have an ID called flying. Okay, because we are giving flying as our ID. Then it will realize, okay, it has one object which is a type skill and ID flying. After that, Spring will just create the object of character, and it will wire the character object with flying. Now Spring not only create object during component scan, it also configure different objects inside the IoT container and wire them so that it understand which object depends on which other objects. So in this case, character depends on flying. We use qualifier annotation to tell Spring what is the ID, so flying, and we also use auto wire to tell Spring, okay, there is a dependency. So that's it. Now this way Spring understand how we want our object to be created, and then Spring will create our objects. Now if you see, Spring just started without any error. Okay, so it started the Spring Boot application without any error. So that's it. That is how Spring Boot handles dependency injection. So in this last two videos, we understood what is dependency injection and how Spring Boot handles it. If you have any question, please ask those questions over the comment section. I'll try to reply. Upcoming video, we will start developing our web service using Spring Boot. And while developing, we will understand also different features of Spring Boot. So see you in the next video. Thank you.